We don't either.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Well, it ends, but then it starts again. Uh, Welcome back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin, co-host with my friend, my confidant, my main man, Mike Sauter, who's looking really tidy today. So, good morning, Mike.
Yeah. I look better than you. Let's just be honest.
That's just true.
Yeah.
I have to accept that. But
No, I have to. I've ever since I was a kid in Catholic school when we had the ties that just clipped on behind, and you had to wear them. And you'd get off the bus and you look something like this. I've always been a fish out of water in anything formal, and
should
I've
be.
luckily had all careers where me and ties consort maybe thrice annually.
It's been a while since I've worn a tie. I think when was the last time probably my mom's funeral last
Yeah,
time.
and
But
mine's
anyway,
funeral associated today.
want to hear a weird story, Mike?
I do.
So, as you know, this room, I think you know, this room where from which I do the podcast, my office, used to be my mother's bedroom,
Yeah.
right? And she died about 2 feet behind me.
Well,
Uh, and then after we cleared all of her stuff out, got the hospital bed out, I moved in. And when I moved in, because that before my whole life,
it's your
I'll
she
have an
shed.
office for like 6 months and then I get kicked out because we have another baby or something, right? So I
It's a good
wrote
way to write
most
your
of it.
autobiography.
I'm not kidding. I wrote the dissertation and I wrote the submerged reality at the counter in the kitchen because
Well,
there's no other place when you have 9 kids in a small house. Um, but one thing I really wanted to hang up in my office was this beautiful print of a silkscreen print of Simone Weil that a student of mine made. Let me see if I can find it for you. There it is. See it way
there
up
she
there?
is. I see her. Yeah. She's
So
got
get
some
this.
numbers below her.
So when I moved in here a year and a half ago, I wanted to put that up and I'm looking all over the house. I thought I had it saved in a special spot. I looked in the special spot. It's not there. I looked all over the house, looked in all the closets, no, couldn't find it. Then 2 days ago, I had to run out in the morning. I can't remember what to do. I had to go someplace, but I was only gone for about half an hour. And I come home and I actually in my office, since we're revamping the kitchen, we have a print of the Sistine Madonna that usually hangs in the kitchen, but it's right now it's against the bookshelf.
I mentioned the Sistine Madonna yesterday in a lecture I gave. Dostoevsky called it the greatest expression of the human spirit ever created. I didn't know
Well,
that.
it hit everybody. It hit Soloviev. It's hit
Yeah.
Bulgakov. It
It was
hit
totally hit
Novalis.
Bulgakov. Yeah.
Actually, it appears in Hymns to the Night by Novalis. But anyway,
Okay.
so I get home and I come into my office and there's neatly set in front of this print of the Sistine Madonna, which is framed, was what I think my brother-in-law, when he was Orthodox, gave me a couple like printed icons of Saint Tikhon, which I don't know anything about him, and I'm like, why are you giving this to me? And there was also like a watercolor painting that one of my kids did in high school. But in there was this print, uh, the silkscreen print of Simone Weil, and so I said, wow, I'm great glad I've been looking for this for 2 years.
Yeah, that's
So
cool.
I asked all my kids, all four of them that live at home right now, none of them to put it in there.
Huh.
Bonnie didn't put anything in there.
Yeah.
And they said, well, maybe it fell off the shelf. Well, maybe it fell off the shelf. It wasn't on the shelf. But I mean, even if it fell off the shelf, they would not fall in a perfect kind of, almost framed right before
Yeah.
the scene
Okay.
was done.
If miracles are kind of about the lesson we learn from them as much as like the thing itself, right? So you're saying this, this has a synchronicity to it.
Yeah,
How
you
did
know
it lift
what?
your spirit that day? Like the Sistine
But
Madonna lifted
but
the
I
spirit of
mentioned
them.
I mentioned it on X, and somebody said, well, today's the feast day of Saint Anthony, right?
Oh,
So
okay. Oh, that's cool. That's a cool one.
And I did when I lost it before. I was praying to Saint Anthony, and usually I get immediate results from Saint Anthony, but I
Yeah.
think he put this one on time delay to prove a point.
I used to
But
get
anyway,
shitty results from St. Anthony until I realized that he didn't find the thing for me, but he helped it'd be what people now call today more ADD. He
yeah,
helped me opened my vision.
Well,
Like my narrow mind of like what my day is like is very
mhm,
narrow. And like all of a
yeah,
sudden when St. Anthony, which we should all do it all the time, live in the now, what's actually going on, all of a sudden you get that orthogonal view
all
and
right.
you remember where you put the damn key,
So here's the get this. So no, my last story before we get
I want
into
to hear
our.
it.
So when I was a Waldorf teacher, I was actually for a few years I was the college chair, which is like being the headmaster
Okay.
before I quit.
Sounds
Um,
British.
and the administrator was ran the business side of the school, and I was the figurehead for the educational side. And she lost the paychecks one Thursday.
Very me.
She comes to me, Michael, I don't know where the checks are. I'm like, what? You don't know where it's the money. Well, I said, no, we got to find it. So we're going to all these different offices, and we run out of places to look, and we go into her office, or actually an office next to her office. And I was standing by this desk, and she was on the other side of the desk, and I just closed my eyes for a second. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Praying to Saint Anthony." And she was not really a believer. She kind of rolls her eyes. And
Huh.
I opened my eyes, and I swear to you, the checks were at my feet
Wow.
on top of a box underneath the desk.
Yeah, there's something symbolic in that, like a lesson you were supposed to learn in addition to finding the check and saying thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah.
So don't mess with prayer. But anyway, we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to have a conversation with somebody I've actually respected for at least a year, Sebastian Morello, who writes for the European Conservative, amongst other things. But he first came to my attention, I believe it was exactly a year ago, when not only somebody, quite a few of my friends kept sending me this link, and it was a link to an article called "Can Hermetic Magic Rescue the Church?" Part
Hmm,
one. And they're like, Michael, this guy's singing your tune right here. Check this
for
out.
sure.
And it did. And as you know, Mike, I mean, I think I published my first piece about Valentin Tomberg, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe more.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and of course, Tomberg shows up in a lot of the things I've written, but I did my dissertation on at least one of the chapters of my dissertation was on Henry and Thomas Vaughan, who were Christian Hermeticists of the 17th century.
Yeah,
So Christian Hermeticism, as they say, is my vibe, right?
yeah.
And then it got even to be more intense. So as I don't know if you read it yet, but my recent publication, Mythologies of the Wild of God, most of the book I wrote in the deer blind over I think it was 2 or 3 deer seasons. There was probably two. Um, and so there's a lot of hunting imagery in there because it was what was on my mind at the time. And then a couple of weeks ago, uh, maybe a month ago, this story shows up since I follow the European Conservative on X, I think, and social media. This article shows up, the theurgy of deer stalking, and I lost it right there. And I read it; it was like a wonderful article. I mean,
I lost
the
it.
thing is, there's a lot of writing about a lot of hunting writing. Most of it stinks, but this was just gorgeous, and it kind of captured my sensibility about hunting, which a lot of people, when a sociologist, you're not supposed to hunt. Oh, yes, I am.
You
So
brought it up recently and I think you explained it so well, Michael. So I didn't know this was going to be one of the focuses, but I would
yeah,
say one of your shining moments is you kind of talking about your spirituality of like taking care of animals and hunting. Yeah, I'm excited about this.
yeah. So welcome to the show, Sebastian Morello.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And this is a mutual admiration society. I'm making my way through the submerged reality. I'm about
Excellent book.
halfway through. I've been, but I haven't read it in the orthodox way. I've been going back and forth and darting around to bits that interest me whilst I've been cruising through the narrative. And yes, I mean, certainly we appear to be kindred spirits. But and I'm very much looking forward to getting to know you, Mike.
Likewise.
So it's a real pleasure to be here. I don't know, can I tell you my own spooky story, since you've been talking about Saint Anthony finding pictures and checks and all sorts of things?
Yes.
So my own one recently, which I still derive great excitement from talking about, is I went to an event in London not too long ago, at which John Vervaeke was the
Oh, yeah.
speaker.
We've had him on the show. Yeah.
Well, he's a great guy, and I have been on his show once, and that was a great pleasure and an honor. And at the end of his talk, which was just a total masterclass, really, I asked him a question, and when he saw me in the audience and he recognized me, he greeted me very warmly, and that was very nice. And he recommended my first book, The World as God's Icon, of which he's a big fan. Recommended that to the audience, and that was all very nice. And then I finally got to ask my question, which was about it was about liturgy as theurgy. And there's a wonderful book. I've got it somewhere on my shelf here. I don't know where I've placed it. It might be on my desk. Anyway, it's by a Lutheran pastor, I think, somewhere in Scandinavia, about who writes about liturgy as theurgy. And obviously John Milbank and other people have written on this topic. So I was sort of thinking this through, and I've been particularly interested in this question of the theurgical practice of incubation, entering the dream world, which is just so prevalent in Holy Scripture. It's on every page of Holy Scripture, and yet it seems to.
We need a whole show on incubation. Go. Yeah, this is great.
I think so, because it's weird. It's weird that it almost plays no part in contemporary Christian spirituality, and yet it's on every page of Holy Scripture. So I asked John about that, and he gave a very good answer to my question, and that was terrific. Anyway, a couple of days later, I was dining at a friend's house, and he said to me, you really ought to read a book called Black Abbot White Magic.
Never heard of it.
It's here. This is Black Abbot White Magic, about Abbot Johannes Trithemius.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Who wrote quite extensively, as you'll likely know, on Christian incubation.
Yeah.
So he said you really ought to order that book and read it. So that's what I did, and the printing press sent me the wrong book. Anyway, a few days later, so I got in touch, asked them to send me the right book. They said, okay, fine.
This is a wild story already.
Keep the book we sent you. Keep the book we sent you.
And that book's going to be significant.
You might enjoy it, and we'll send you the book you actually wanted. Okay, fine. A few days later, this friend says to me, oh, I listened to a recording of John Vervaeke's recent talk in London, and I really liked the question that you asked at the end. And I said, oh, thank you. He said, did you ever order the book that he asked you to get? And I said, I don't remember him asking me to get it. He said, yeah, right at the end of answering your question, he said, oh, and you really ought to get this book called The Higher Sophia, the Sanctum of Kronos, which is all about ancient theurgy.
Who wrote that one?
And I look up at the shelf, and the book that the printing press had accidentally sent me was The Higher Sophia, the Sanctum of Kronos. And so I sort of fell off my chair, and so I looked up this book online, and it turns out that there is only one printing press in the world, it seems, that publishes this book, which is just run by a little couple in deepest, darkest Cornwall. And they just happen to also be the only publisher of Black Abbot White Magic. And they just happened to accidentally send me the book that John had recommended. So all these things sort of coalesced. And I think, you know, if you need proof after things like that happen, that this is a world pregnant with angelic beings who are completely and utterly involved in our lives and constantly orchestrating things for our good, then I think, you know, you need to open your eyes, really. So I think that's
great story. What a great story. Yeah.
Well, yes, I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's who are the authors of Higher Sophia?
That's I think he's an Englishman
Okay.
who his name is Peter Mark Adams.
Okay.
And I think he lives in Istanbul.
Huh.
And has spent a huge amount of time visiting the Great High Sophia. So the Great Divine Sophia. So there you go. Anyway.
Wow.
So
that's my little story.
That was a great story.
Right. Yeah.
So why don't you, Sebastian, if you could, why don't you give us a little bit of your background and how you ended up where you ended up?
Okay, I'll try to give you the whistle-stop tour, because otherwise it can get very boring. So where shall I begin? Born in Kent, first part of my childhood in the port city of Bristol. Then we moved out to the countryside. I went off to boarding school for most of my childhood, which you know, ensured that I had a fairly miserable childhood. And then well, you know, English boarding schools are not.
I'm thinking of John Cooper Powys again, like not a fan of his boarding school
Yeah,
experience.
yeah,
Not a
yeah.
fan. Not a fan. Yeah.
They're not. They're pretty charmless places, but you know, I had many wonderful experiences as a child. Nonetheless, my father ran a company in Africa for a few years, and I was taken out of school and essentially home educated for a few years. And there wasn't really a lot of formal education going on. I just went on safari and traveled around Africa and just did amazing things. And then the moment I could leave school, I did. And then I went to an arts college and studied drama. And that was a very important moment, I think. Looking back, I wouldn't have put it like this at the time, but looking back, you know, as you know, modern Western education is extremely STEM heavy, as it were. And
Understatement of the year.
yeah, and studying the dramatic arts at an arts college to get a national diploma just opened up this whole world of knowledge that was narrative based, that was interpersonal, that was interested in characters, and it wasn't. I mean, it was. It is still considered by most people not real education, but it was the most formative education I received, really. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was essentially discovering what it was to have a humane view of the formation of the intellect and the formation of the heart. And so that was a very important moment. And then, you know, I was planning to enter a drama college and do a tertiary education in drama and hope to get onto the stage in the West End or something. And at the time, that not discounting what I just said about how the arts can open up the mind to a humane understanding of the human person, there is also a great deal of superficiality in the arts and a lot of bad behavior and backstabbing and things that are less edifying that goes on. and it's unbelievably competitive as well.
Yeah.
Which you certainly get a sense of that when you are auditioning at top drama schools around the country.
Same
Like,
thing as working for the church, by the way.
yeah. Well, I mean,
It's a fact. Just a
I
fact.
well, I was later in my life a church official for 7 years, and
Yeah.
so I know that world as well. And it's I've never met someone who said, oh, the episcopacy are just such fair employers, and they take employment law really seriously, and it's such a just environment. It's really edifying. And I've never come across that. So, but anyway, the uh, yeah. So I suppose at that time I started to think a great deal about religious commitment, almost in a kind of distant, speculative way. I was reading a lot of books on comparative religion, in particular, and I remember I did a short bit of work at a production company to make music videos in London at that time. So I must have been about 18. And speaking to a chap who was in the production company, and we were in the car together going off to film something, and I started asking him about whether he had any religious views. And he said, well, if I were to ever to become anything, I suppose I'll become Catholic. And I looked at him with absolute horror. I thought, that's not even a religion, I mean, when I talk about religion, I'm talking about mystical experience. I'm talking about a life filled with meaning and purpose. I'm not talking about this kind of a vile Western bourgeois organization. That's not what I have in mind. And so I look back at that time with great irony. But anyway, during that period, as I was preparing to go to a drama school, I was reading these books. And I became very attracted to visiting churches. There were, I live in rural Bedfordshire, and around here there are a huge number of early medieval churches. In fact, just up the road, there's a pre-Norman church. There's a church that's about
Wow.
1,200 years old, built by the Saxons, just about a 5-minute drive away. So there are these buildings that are they almost call to you as you drive past, and the stones themselves seem to be saturated with the prayers of countless generations. And so I used to go into these buildings and just sit there, and one day, it's slightly awkward for an Englishman to talk about this sort of thing, but I walked into a nearby medieval church, and it was empty, and I walked in, and I just felt this overwhelming desire to kneel down. And I knelt down, and I looked up at the stained glass, and I looked up at the crucifix, and the most astonishing, I don't really know how to put it into words. I've at various times in my life I've tried to convey this, and it's never really worked, but just this overwhelming presence of infinite love just enveloped me, and I have no idea how long I remained in that state, just of pure receptivity. But I remember walking out of the church and feeling very emotional, and looking around, and the whole world looked different. It was like the entire paradigm of late modernity, of pure efficiency and productivity, and this meaning vacuum into which I had been inducted had been eradicated in a passing moment, and suddenly I saw the universe for what it was, this incredible divine communication. It all looked completely different, and I looked up at the trees and the sky, and it was almost like I could see creation from albeit partially, from the perspective of the creator, and I loved it, and I loved its author.
Wow. Wow.
And so I just want, and that sent me on a real quest, really.
Yeah.
I decided I didn't want to go into acting. I didn't know what to do. I started working at a car garage, and just and also working with a local builder to lay driveways, and just finding odd jobs. I pulled pints in a local pub, just found things to occupy myself and keep me going. And after a year or so, I had a bit of money in the bank. So I thought, right, well, I'm going to go and travel. And so I went and I spent a year traveling around India. And I lived in ashrams, and I spent time with yoga instructors, and I I mean, I can't believe I did it now. I was 19 years old, and I would never allow one of my own children to behave in that way. But I just it's so wonderful that my parents just thought, well, he's always been a bit eccentric. Let's just let him do what he does. So I just I wandered around sleeping in temples and in doorways, and just a total bum, really. And I enrolled and studied for a while under the Dalai Lama, and then I was up in the Himalayas, um, and I saw this, what looked like an angel on the other side of the valley on a mountain, and this angel moving around, and then one day I met this kind of angelic creature, and it was a nun. It was a nun from Austria who was there renewing her visa in her habit. And I was staying in a hut nearby, and or in a little room, and she and I would meet and discuss things. And she basically catechized me without me knowing it. And she said, look, my community have a little monastery in Tamil Nadu. So if you ever do get to the south of India, visit there. And so after a year of traveling around India, I ended up there, and I lived there for a few months. And then I was received into the Catholic Church on the south coast of India. The monks there, particularly one monk, Father Charbel, with whom I've just made a film for YouTube, because he now lives in the foothills of the Alps, and we went out and I made a film with him. He completely he understood that whatever the Christian religion had to be, it could not be something mundane. It couldn't be something quotidian. It had to be the radical call into a spousal mystery with the one who has called us out of nothing into being for love of us. And he got that. And so he formed me according to that view. And I'm very grateful to him. So I became Catholic, came back, and the rest is history, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. What a wonderful story.
Yeah, and you use the word formed so powerfully too, and we'll come back to that. Go, Michael. Yeah.
No, well, that's I mean,
yeah,
that's that's a fascinating story. And so you eventually, I think you did a doctorate. Where was this?
Yeah, so when I came back, I tried I sort of dipped my toe a few times into various religious orders, tried to work out whether all the zeal of a new convert. I thought,
Yeah.
I must become a friar or something, and none of that really worked out. I tried for a while in Italy, then in Ireland, and sorry, other way around, and eventually I came back, was working for a kind of a little charity that worked on researching for pro-life campaigns and stuff like that. And I had a girlfriend at the time, and the relationship never worked out. But I'm immensely grateful to her, because she was the one who said to me, "Look, all you ever do is read philosophy and talk about philosophy and its connection to your religious commitments. You clearly should go and get a degree in this." And I said, well, I can't, because I don't have any of the qualifications or credentials to do that. I can't get into a university. And she said, well, there's a little Catholic institute called the Maryvale Institute up in Birmingham, and they will take you to do a degree part-time while you work over 5 years, on the back of an interview. So why don't you try? And I kicked my feet, and she just insisted. She actually drove me up there, and so I started doing. I thought, well, I'll do it for a year just because I think it's interesting and see how I get on. So I did it for a year, really enjoyed it, kept at it, ended up getting a first class degree with honors from that institute, and validated by the Open University. And then during that period, I had started to get very involved in a Catholic liberal arts project in London, whose kind of leading advisor was the philosopher Roger Scruton.
Mhm.
And he invited me to, he had just started running a master's by research program at the University of Buckingham. And he invited me to come and do the master's with him, again, while I was working. And so I ended up doing that on the role of Neoplatonism in the thought of Aquinas, which I later developed into my first book, The World as God's Icon. And at the end of that degree, which was quite successful, he said, "Look, do a doctorate with me." And so he supervised me alongside a chap based at Oxford University, a Catholic priest, Andrew Pinsent, and that's really where I started trying to develop my own political thought through that doctoral research, which became the book Conservatism and Grace with Routledge. And so, yeah, that's how I kind of got my degrees over a 10-year period between my sort of early 20s and early 30s. And it all sort of happened by accident, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And this is kind of, you know, when I was a bit younger, I really had this idea of my life that it was my project, and I've come to realize that basically everything that's ever happened to my life has kind of happened to me, and I wasn't really expecting it. So I've in more recent years, I've just sort of reconciled myself to that.
I've abandoned the thought that I'm actually in control of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, well, I can see then with this kind of open-ended kind of interest in the world and in the religious traditions of the world, I can see why eventually you made your way to Christian Hermeticism. But how long did that take?
Well, it's sort of always been there, but
Okay.
before I had that sort of religious experience that I described earlier, as in my teens, I was deeply attracted to theosophy and the New Age movement and the Druidic movement, the Neo-Druidic movement in the UK. I actually became a member of the Order of Bards, what is it, Druids, Bards, and Ovids in the UK, and was extremely, because I really did believe very strongly that that there is a universal religious genius that manifests itself particularly in particular communities. And so I kind of understood that tradition quite deeply. And the funny thing was, just after when I kind of realized after I became a Catholic that religious life or the priesthood wasn't really for me, and so someone said to me, you should really get to reading Thomas More and studying his life, because he's a really good example of a Christian layman who really strove for holiness and could be a great example to you. And so I read so much Thomas More. I became really interested in him. But then one day I came across, funnily enough, someone had said, look to Thomas More for the ideal of a layman. But of course, Thomas More himself wrote a book about who he thought was the ideal of a layman, the great holy layman. and that was his biography of Pico della Mirandola.
Right.
Mhm.
And so, and I became really interested in Pico, and I read On the Dignity of Man and the Heptaplus and the One and the Many, and I went through his works and was just completely enthralled. And then I started reading Marsilio Ficino and became so interested in that whole Christian humanist movement in the Quattrocento, and this the way, you know, and obviously Ficino, I've actually got his commentary on the Corpus Hermeticum right
Yeah.
here that I've been dipping in and out. He, you know, he was just immersed in that world, and the more, you know, having come from my degree at the Maryvale Institute was fantastic. I'm very very grateful for the formation I received there, but I would say it was heavy late scholastic, you know, and even my final dissertation was on the school of Salamanca and the school of
Okay,
Valladolid.
well, yeah.
Late scholasticism, the early manualist tradition. That was very much my training. And whilst it gave me a kind of rigor, it also, I think, it can encage the intellect.
Yeah.
And kind of going through the Renaissance humanists and discovering what you, Michael, would call the submerged sociological tradition that is always rearing its head at different times in history in different places. To me, it was kind of liberating, because it meant that my the intellectual journey that I had undergone could now be wedded to my experience of a I'm really trying to, the trouble is, the words that are coming to me are words that sound incredibly pompous if you use them. So I'm trying to think of other, but I suppose what I want to say is my experience of the world and myself as mystical. And that's, and I'm very embarrassed to speak like that, because it sounds so kind of conceited and bizarre and pompous, but I think that is what
You know
I'm
what,
getting.
Sebastian? I think, one of the ways out for that language, and I'm not trying to offer you advice or something. I think,
Please do.
what like a Coventry Patmore, the idea of the incarnation or the infinite in the finite, that when we say mystical, it's like this phrase he said, supernatural is supernaturally natural. And I think that sense of feeling pompous can be kind of counteracted when we embrace this idea that, like, oh, no, we're talking about more incarnation, more
This is
incarnation, and I think that's almost the key message we need to get out there. Because the people, you're right, the people, if you sit next to in a coffee shop, the first person to say I'm mystical, they're flighty.
Oh gosh,
I mean,
yeah,
I
what a
get it.
bore. Yeah.
Right. And
But
I share your repulsion at that, but
Yeah.
the shorthand is the supernatural is supernaturally natural,
yeah.
expressed in
And I think,
humor and conversation and interest in other people.
well, exactly. And I think that point, maybe we don't want to segue there too early, but that point very, very much connects this to my interest in field sports and hunting and so on, because it's these activities that enable one to approach creation in a participatory way,
Right.
or even I'd say a hyper participatory way.
Yeah.
Because it completely assumes all of your awareness and everything. You kind of you forget yourself, you become part of the landscape. Those are mystical moments, actually. And that's why I'm very suspicious of a mysticism, of a Christian mysticism that understands mysticism purely as ascent out of the created world into some kind of.
Welcome to the Regeneration Podcast.
Yeah, no kidding. Mic drop. Right. Now, so just to before we get into that, and I do want to get into that,
it's essential.
Desperately. But I think you mentioned the Florentine Renaissance, which I think is so important. And I can't, when I used to teach in 7th grade as a Waldorf teacher, it's hard once you start to enter into that world to realize, it's hard to not realize what was lost with the coming of the Reformation right on the heels of that.
Hmm.
Because uh what I think was happening with Pico and Ficino. Ficino was a Catholic priest and an astrologer. Um, they were opening up and I think the word humanism might have the wrong connotation for a lot of people, because for a lot of people it doesn't, it's not even Christian humanism, it's mostly rationalistic, and
Hmm.
that's not what they were doing at all. I mean, there was certainly rationality involved with it, but it was a um, integrated mystical and intellectual tradition and artistic. I mean, when you mention it, I can't help but see Michelangelo's creation of Adam with Sophia under the arm of God the Father, and that the chariot, or if you will, that God the Father travels in is actually a bisection of the human brain,
Yes, yes, yeah.
which is, I mean, that if that's not sociology, I don't know what is. Right? It is.
Yeah,
And
right,
and
right,
it's
right.
absolutely scriptural. It's coming right from Proverbs 8, right?
But I think also
Uh,
that the humanism that um, is attributed to that intellectual and cultural movement is a humanism that sees the true religious worldview to be part of the human genius, and
Yeah.
and one of the things that I think you see. Let me put this. This is going to be a bit provocative, but let me put it this way. I time and again feel that a lot of what passes as Catholic spirituality denotes a kind of religion of fear. And I don't mean a religion of fear in
Yeah, yeah.
in the sense of, like the Sisters of Mercy whacking their students with rulers or whatever. I don't that's not what I mean.
I
I
totally
just
follow you. Yeah.
yeah, I just mean that this kind of that anything that doesn't have a magisterial stamp is, under the reign of Satan or whatever, right?
mhm.
And whereas actually the really creative dialogue that was going on between the church and Egyptian wisdom and Greek wisdom and the Roman legal system and all of these things, and the formation of the nations after the Great Migration period, all of these things that have gone on through church history, our entire Catholic architectural tradition, what begins with Abbot Suger basically trying to
Mhm.
take
Right.
Neoplatonic theurgical genius and render it in glass and stone, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it is, and it's worrying to me that today the only people who are really interested in that, people like, well, from the last century, Falconelli, or
Yeah.
more recently John Michel or Keith Critchlow, or John Tom Bree, whom I hopefully will be
Right.
making a
Hmm.
film with later this year. These people are either not Catholic, or I mean, I don't think any of them even kind of belong to a denomination. They're completely outside um, the the canonically recognized fold, so to speak,
Right.
and yet they are engaging with our own spiritual tradition
Right.
in a way that is almost unseen in the ad intra Catholic Church today.
So well
And so,
said. Holy
Interesting.
crap. Yeah.
Actually, believe it or not, I was just talking on the phone yesterday with longtime guest of the Regeneration podcast and one of my best friends forever, Therese Schroeder-Sheeker, who was actually she was connected back in the day with the Lindisfarne Association, with Christopher Bamford. She was really best friends with Chris. But also she was talking about what a wonderful human being Keith Critchlow was.
oh yeah,
Um, and they were doing this. I mean, that so much of you could call it the modern or the late 20th century Celtic revival, Celtic Christian revival, came out of that movement, and Christopher Bamford in particular, who unfortunately died before we were able to interview him on the
Yeah.
show,
Yeah.
but with whom I was he encountered my work and he said, you're a kindred spirit, so. But it's out there. But you're right. These are people who were not Catholic necessarily, right?
Right,
But
right.
who saw the wisdom and the truth and the beauty in these kinds of traditions we're talking about. And you see it also, I think, in Thomas Traherne is a great example,
Mhm.
where it's not the emphasis on the manualist, okay, let me count my sins business, but on becoming a child again and entering the kingdom, right? Which is a great way to segue into a discussion of hunting. Talk about entering the kingdom. Now, interesting, when I read your article, The Theurgy of Deer Stalking, and I recommend everybody read it. When I posted it on this is how we got in touch with you. um, I saw it dropped by the European Conservative on X, and I reposted it, and my tag was, "I love this so much it hurts," because because I do. But one of the things I noticed though, and I've talked about this with people over time, that there is really a different sensibility when we talk about hunting from an American perspective than from a European perspective, where because in Europe, hunting traditionally or historically was the province of the nobility. Where in my argument is that in America, it was a bunch of, wildcats from France and mostly from France, but England, where I live, France, who wanted to get away from that, and they were able to hunt and enter nature on their own terms, right? So it was an emancipation of sorts. But the thing is, I think what happened when those, especially the French, came to the New World and we're doing trapping and hunting. But there were also, and this is actually my wife and my side of the family, we all have native blood because the French were that were not reluctant to intermarry with native women in particular, and there is a an intense spirituality and relationship to the land in Native American spirituality, and so many, like I have right over on my desk, I have a print of Nicholas Black Elk,
Yeah.
who was a medicine man who became basically a deacon in the Catholic Church, where it's a beautiful picture where he's showing a little girl a rosary. And they saw no problem because the language those probably the Jesuits were speaking to them was a language they already knew, and their introduction to Jesus through the Jesuits was an introduction to someone they already knew,
Mm.
and it was connected to nature in a way that the manualist traditions for certain is not. So I wonder, Sebastian, if you could talk a little bit about now your entrance into the idea of hunting, but also your experience, which caused you to write this article.
Well, uh, I've only been thinking about this in a critical way in the last couple of years because I was first taken hunting. I wasn't raised in a hunting family, but I got to know probably one of my closest friends at boarding school, whipped in for a pack of hounds up in Shropshire. And so he invited me to join him. And I don't know if you've ever gone hunting with a pack of hounds, but this was just before the Tony Blair's Hunting Act. So now hunting with hounds is a much more limited affair in the United Kingdom. But then it was proper full hunting of a quarry, and it's a very strange thing because you kind of you stand out there and you think, I don't really know why this is happening. Now there are all kinds of efficiency based reasons for hunting with hounds, and the fact that you generally always use a hound that's slower than the quarry, so you're almost always getting injured or diseased animals, and it was traditionally a genuine part of rural management, quite an important one. And the people who banned it without really knowing at all the reasons why it developed in the country.
I'd never heard that about slower and everything. That's brilliant.
Yeah, so you would never use foxhounds to hunt a hare because foxhounds would be too fast. So you use foxhounds on a fox, you use beagles or harriers on a hare.
Yeah.
And the reason is that you're making sure that healthy ones can get away, basically. So there are all sorts of kind of important reasons as to how it developed. And of course, hunting with hounds goes back to well, I mean, it was introduced in this country by the Romans about 200 BC, I think. So it's got a pretty venerable tradition here. Anyway, but it is weird. It is weird because you kind of stand there and you're trying to keep up with the hounds, and they're sort of racing off after a hare here, there, and they're always missing it, and everyone thinks it's jolly good fun, but no one quite knows why. And what I realized about it is you either get it or you don't. And I suppose one of the things that, because of my slightly sort of romantic view of the world, or not slightly, but one of the reasons why it appealed to me so much was that I felt like I was participating in something that didn't belong to any particular time. That I had suddenly stepped into this human-animal collaborative act that was, to use Jungian terms, it was kind of archetypal, you know, and it was, again, I mean, it goes back to the idea of the if late modernity or modernity per se is what I say it is, which is essentially one long flight from reality, what hunting with hounds seem to allow for is a kind of flight from modernity.
Right. You know what? Do you know this book, Meditations on Hunting by Jose?
Oh yeah, Ortega. Yeah.
Well, he says hunting is a vacation from the human experience.
Yeah.
It takes you out of modernity, which is one of the primary reasons for doing it.
But it also plunges you into the human experience in a much more universal, deeper sense, or you become fully human, and you develop a moral relation with your environment and with your prey. And essentially, I mean, not in the case of hunting with hounds, because if they catch anything, at least when hunting quarry was allowed, then they feed on it. But
what would be the best Eastern? At some point, ask me or answer. What would be the best Eastern self of view's argument about that? If somebody, does that make sense? Like,
Eastern.
how would you Eastern? Like, you spent a lot of time in India.
Right. Yeah.
You read deeply. Like, what would be the best for our listeners? The best counter position to where what you and Michael are saying now. You know, if they're vegetarians and so forth, like
Sure.
how have you received the best critique of saying it's still butchery or something?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I don't know. I'll have to give that some thought, but certainly
absolutely.
I would say that one of the things that Indian religion is incredibly broad, but one of the things that has impressed me about certain Indian writers, one example which you'll probably both know quite well is Sri Aurobindo, who was obviously deeply influenced by Steiner and the theosophical movement and so on. One of the things that they're very sensitive towards is the danger of false emotion. And that false emotion is a kind of illusion, and the sort of sentimentalism that we have developed towards animals in late modernity is a very dangerous type of false emotion. Not only because it allows people who don't know anything about rural management constantly intervene in the management of the landscape, on the grounds that they feel righteous in doing so, and therefore there's no real moral obligation on them to know anything about it, because they already know that they are good in their decision.
That's the Wendell Berry take on it here in the United States.
Right. Okay. So that, I think, is a very dangerous thing. But even what sentimentalism towards animals does, and of course the great culprit is organizations like Disney in all of this. But what it does is it breaks down the moral relation that exists between human beings and the animal kingdom, the rest of the animal kingdom. A very good example is not far from here. There's a small village, very nice village, on the outskirts of which is a farm, and that farm had its own abattoir. There are very few private abattoirs left in the United Kingdom. They've nearly all closed down. But this farm insisted on maintaining its own abattoir. And the reason for that was that the farmer believed that industrial abattoirs were bad places where animals were not looked after properly in the final moments of their life. And if you've ever been inside an industrial abattoir, it is like entering a nightmare. They are absolutely terrifying places. And a group of people in the village started a campaign to try and basically to pressure this farmer into getting rid of his abattoir.
Really?
And the reason that because they started a line outside the farm, and they were, calling him names and telling him he was disgraceful in maintaining this place, and that he had to close it down. And he went out quite bravely to discuss this with them and try and work out what the issue was. And one of the ladies said to him, I walk my daughter to the local primary school in the morning, and she sees the lambs playing. And now we know that those lambs are about to go into that building and be slaughtered. This is horrible for my daughter to learn this. And he sort of said, well, are you a vegetarian? Well, no, I'm not a vegetarian. He said, right, so you want me to now send off these lambs, because it's not like they're not going to die. They're just going to go off to an industrial abattoir where they're going to be terrified, and they're going to be in a line, and they're going to watch each lamb in front of them getting killed, and their adrenaline is going to be through the roof, and they're going to be, all of their stress hormones are going to be extremely acute, and that's what you prefer. And the funny thing was, that is what they preferred.
They prefer. Not all of them, but yeah. Yep.
Well, today I talked to people. So I just came in the house before we started this interview. I just came in the house from the barn from feeding the lambs, but they're there for the same reason. Even though, like I mentioned before, I love these animals.
Sure.
But they're heading to the freezer.
Sure.
But it's like we always say, they have a great life and one bad day. And it's true. I mean, you really do take care of the animals. It's true. Yeah. It's true.
But everybody's going to have that bad day, and that's kind of part of Sebastian's thing. Yeah. We die once, but we're mortal every day.
That's not true. That's not true for the majority of farmed animals. I mean, in the United Kingdom, I think 70% of all of our antibiotics goes on pigs.
Yeah.
Because essentially they're born into these metal containers, and they're pumped full of all sorts of hormones, and their legs can't support them. They're huge, and they're swollen, and they break their ankles, and then you have to fill them with antibiotics so they don't rot before you're going to kill them. And essentially you've brought this being into hell, and you cause it to live in hell until you kill it in probably what is one of the most harrowing ways, in one of the most harrowing environments. And someone will look at you because you go out into the woods and you shoot a roebuck in the season, and you dress it there, and and you grollock it and you bring it back and you put it in your freezer and you feed your family on it, and they'll look at you like you are an absolute monster
Mhm.
for behaving in that way whilst they are tucking into a battery chicken. And
Right.
you just kind of think, what? That is the kind of false emotion. If
Mhm.
our if a, if human beings have an obligation to be sensitive to the truth and unite themselves to it and not to live in a lie, then that is one of the great prevailing lies of the time in which we live.
Right.
I
I
like your
tell
phrase,
people,
tucking into a battery
right.
kitchen.
Well,
Tucking into a battery kitchen.
yeah.
Chicken,
Oh,
yeah.
chicken, right, yeah, yeah. Chicken, chicken.
Well, I tell people, who when they want to engage me about that, I said, well, the difference between us is that you outsource your killing.
Yeah, always,
Mm.
I
always.
do it, right?
Yeah.
And there's, I mean, you better believe it. I mean, whether you're shooting a buck or one of your own animals for the table, you don't take the people who do that take it so seriously. It's not taken
Of
lightly
course.
ever. And you mentioned in your article about taking the shot at the deer, where you held back from taking a neck shot because you weren't certain you could make it, though you when
And I've messed up a shot before, and uh, it takes a while to recover from it.
yes, it does,
Um,
absolutely.
I've messed up a shot. It took me 2 hours to track it,
Yep.
and dispatch it. And the moral obligation that you feel towards your own quarry, which is why I say that to hunt you have to become fully human, because that is not an immoral obligation that a lion or a hyena or a wolf feels.
No.
It's something unique to humans, where they see their quarry, they see their prey, and they feel a very, very deep obligation to honor it in the kill. And
Right.
if that person is a good hunter, a decent hunter, and if you do screw it up, and I have screwed it up before, it's a very I would say it's a traumatic experience, actually, and
Absolutely.
it takes you a
Mhm.
while to
Absolutely.
recover from it. Yeah.
Hmm. And it's interesting. I just read um the Tristan and Isolde, and in the beginning of
Mm.
Tristan and Isolde, there's an example where Tristan is teaching people how to treat the game, which
Mm.
I love that. That's one of my favorite parts. That is my favorite part of the entire book, because and there's more of a tradition of this in Europe, I think, than in America. Though you certainly get it when we shoot an animal, the first when we so the first thing we do is thank it
Mm.
when we get to the body, right? It's basically a prayer. So um there's a sacramental aspect to it, right? There's a great essay, you probably know it, by Gary Snyder, called
No, I don't.
Long Hair.
Mm.
And he calls it, he's I can't we don't have it at hand, but he says something along the lines that the deer have a plot. They're letting men shoot them and then eat them. And eventually, when enough men have shot and eaten enough deer, the deer will take over. This is
Mm.
called the takeover from inside. So it's entering into the wild, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it's the wild of God. It's a sacramental wildness, right?
Well,
It,
this
it's
is
not
the topic that I think is way more interesting than the moral aspect of hunting. I think what's way more interesting is, excuse me, is what um is the worldview that suddenly you adopt when you hunt. Um, and moving from hunting with hounds, which I still do through the season, and I'm very involved in a local pack here. But when I started deer stalking and shooting pigeon and rabbit and so on, and you make that move from being a facilitator of a hunt to being the predator yourself, um, the you as I put it in that article that you've referenced, you move with the predators of the earth. you find that you are one of the creatures of the earth, and you're moving and you're prowling and you're moving along the hedgerows, and you become hyper alert. When I go and walk my dog every afternoon up on the hills here, which I do, and I take that time to think through my ideas and what I need to write and so on.
Mhm.
I'm surprisingly unaware of what is going on around me.
Mhm.
And I can see why people become very interested in the idea of mindfulness and all of these things of being much more aware, because you can just wrap yourself up in the closed, cloistered world of ideas and become unaware of the world. But you can't do that when you're hunting. Hunting is kind of, if you like, it's the practice of mindfulness taken to its absolute
Absolutely.
extremity.
Mhm.
And and this is, I suppose if I, one way to put it, which might be a slightly sort of Hegelian way to put it, is what hunting has become in my life is a way of reconciling myself to the world in which I found myself.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I think you're right when you mentioned that
I follow.
to be in the field or in the woods, there's a, and it's an interesting thing. You probably experienced this. Um, you have to be aware, but the more you kind of cogitate or think about what you're doing, the less you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only when you're present to it, and it's the only way I can describe it. In fact, I think I must have been inspired by your article. I was asked to write an essay for a collection on William Desmond, and I just handed it in last week. It's called Hunting the Between, because I was using hunting as a kind of metaphor or analogy for not only philosophy but also poetry, because to make those things happen, it's, you can't do it by force, you can't do it by intellectual force, you have to be present
Mm.
to it. You have to be present. And it kind of, when I talk to my friends who are poets, and that have this experience, when you're not there, the poems don't come. You have to,
Yes.
it's a really different kind of state of mind you have to be in. The same thing is true in hunting. And then we could say, kind of like your experience in the church almost. And I don't want to sanctify hunting more than I need to, but there, you can experience at that church where something opens up, right? So what von Balthasar calls splendor, where
Mm.
the world opens up to you. And I wrote about it in Sophia in Exile. And I mentioned Teresa there. So a few years ago, when I was hunting, maybe a couple of hundred yards from where I'm sitting right now, it was a cold November morning, and I was just present there. And then this buck kind of arose out of the swamp, almost like a vision. It was, and I'm thinking, this is the one. This is what I'm supposed to take. And I later that day, I was talking to Therese, and she said, my friends who are Native Americans say that you didn't shoot the buck; it gave itself to you,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And it's true. It was
Well,
offered. There's no.
it is certainly. I again, I mean, I think, as you may have got from my Hermetic essays, I think you and I have a slightly different take, Michael, on the nature supernature relation and distinction, and I'm not quite as sympathetic to the Nouvelle Theology movement as I think you are. Um, on the other hand, with that small qualification, I am I I'm a great defender of the idea that nature possesses a sacrality of its own. And when you and that's why I use the language of the cosmos as divine language. And when you are out hunting, it's quite strange. I mean, fox hunters talk about this because um, I don't have land on which to hunt. Um, so wherever I hunt, I hunt with permission from other people. There is no common land in England. Every square inch of Britain is owned by somebody. So if you're hunting either on your own land or with somebody else's permission. When people fox hunt, because they're riding over many miles, they need to ask permission from all the farmers over whose land they're going to hunt. And if the hounds go onto land where they don't have permission, it's often the work of the hunt staff to do all sorts of things like go over to that farmer's house afterwards and give them a bottle of whiskey and hope it was all right, and and but what fox hunters often say, and Roger Scruton in his book on hunting speaks about this at length, that private ownership disappears when you're hunting. And the land suddenly becomes one thing, right? It's just one great landscape across which you're riding in total freedom. And I think something similar happens with deer stalking. Even though you've got the permission of this person's land or a few people's land in that area, when you're actually there with your centerfire rifle hunting, you just feel like you're on the hallowed landscape that God has made. You don't.
Yeah.
It ceases to become this guy's garden or that guy's field or whatever. It just becomes the creation, and that in itself, I think, bestows on it a kind of gravity. That what you're doing. But what surprises me, and I say this at the beginning of my essay on hunting, what surprises me about England is because we are so religiously frozen in this country, we just don't have many spiritual traditions that orbit our hunting culture. Even though we have a very rich culture of stalking and shooting and fishing and hunting and all of these things, which, like everywhere else, are constantly under attack by people who have become removed from all of that.
By busybodies.
Yeah, but nonetheless, we do have a very rich culture of that. But it's become completely divorced from our religious commitments, and that's problematic for me because as of the kind of worldview I have that I've explained to you, and so it was quite interesting when I was out deer stalking last season with one of my closest friends who trained me up, my son's godfather, and we've been stalking for about 2 hours. Chinese water deer that were released from Woburn about 100 years ago in this area. So we have these bizarre oriental big fluffy deer with fangs that are all over the fields here. And we were out stalking those. And every single time we thought we were in position, we would spook them, and it was becoming really difficult. And after a while, I said to my friend, we should. I think the problem that we have here is that we haven't asked permission of the guardians of the hunt, and we need to kneel down and pray to Saint Hubert and pray to Our Lady of the Hunt and pray to all of the spirits and the cosmic agents who operate to make our life possible. And that's what we did. And we prayed to Saint Hubert and we prayed to Our Lady of the Hunt. And within about 20 minutes, we had shot 3 Chinese water deer and we're dressing them, bringing them out. It was quite an amazing moment. And he brings that up. My friend brings that up quite often because it's sort of quite an important moment for him, I think.
I think for me too.
Yeah. And so, and even though I may be one of the only sort of field sportsmen who's doing this in England, I'm trying to integrate, and that's what the theology of deer stalking was really all about. It was about wedding together that to use that term, that sociological worldview with hunting, from which I've derived so much meaning and purpose in my life. And on the continent, for example, there's a tradition in the more Catholic cultures, like in France and Hungary and so on, that when you when you've gone hunting, you take your quarry and you put oak leaves in its mouth to give it its last meal to honor it, and you blow hunting horns to kind of salute it, and then you sing old hunting songs, often to Saint Hubert and Saint Eustace, the patron saints of hunting, in order to honor the quarry. And you do all of these things because you're not well, I suppose it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning, because you have a moral relation to this creature.
Right.
You're not a hyena, you're not a wolf, you're not a lion, you're a human being, and even if that creature doesn't have a moral relation with you, you have a moral relation with it, and you have to take that very, very seriously, and you have to ritualize that, and you have to enact it out. Otherwise you won't be fully human in the act. And so yes, maybe I'm probably a bit eccentric as a field sportsman in England in that way. But
I have a
didn't
theory.
mind.
I have a theory, Michael, is very roughly formed. Is when you said like the Sebastian, your relationship to the Nouvelle Theologie, you prayed during your hunt to Saint Hubert. I almost think the sociological worldview, and tell me if you agree with me, Michael, could be to say that that whole world, what you described so well, is much more central than you think. We would apply it all to Sophia, the divine feminine. And it's almost like raise it up many, many ranks,
Yeah.
and this might be where from the age of Pisces to the age of Aquarius, the emphasis is here, folks. And it's kind of moving from masculine to feminine. It's moving from top down to bottom up. I think these are some of the themes that I think are implicit,
well, I think
maybe.
The Heideggerian term disclosure really means a lot here, because when you enter into the world of the hunt, something is disclosed.
Yes.
Which is not there. I mean, like you said, the people who don't get it, who want to put all these limitations on what people do in the fields, the reason they don't get it is because they have a Walt Disney relationship to nature, or they've these are the people who call their dogs their children, right?
Yeah.
My dog baby. And people who are dog moms, right?
I have an essay on that as well, by the way.
Yeah.
But
it's a lot.
But that's what poetry,
philosophy,
that's what liturgy is. These things are all about the disclosure of something that that is only, and this is sociological, it's only just, we talked about Sophia being asleep. Well, she's not asleep. We're asleep. And it's only by our attention to things, as Simone Weil, just to go back to the beginning, who says attention is the purest and rarest form of generosity, that only by our attention to things do they reveal themselves to us. And that's why you can't impose your will on nature. Like you couldn't, that's why you kept spooking the deer.
Yes.
In a way you were when we do that, we're kind of hunting from the head and not from the heart or from the being, right? And then you stop to pray, and then they show up, and it's true, absolutely true. I do the same thing.
To use your phrase, the deer will only give themselves when you stop being a Baconian.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And I think again the key words go. I'm sorry, Sebastian.
Well, to go back to your initial point, Mike, about this understood through sociological terms and through this notion, this inspiration of the divine feminine. One thing I would say about that is that I read a book a year or so ago that is one of a small handful of books I would be prepared to call life-changing. And that was Jean Hanny's The Black Virgin, which I'm sure are you both familiar with that book?
Yeah.
I'm not.
Okay. It is without a doubt the most exquisite work of Marian theology I have ever encountered.
By Hanny. Okay.
Yeah, Jean Hanny, The Black Virgin. And one of the things he says in that book is that for that obviously the incarnation does not simply give rise to the possibility of infusing human nature with grace, but all creation. Otherwise, there would be no renewal of heaven and earth at the eschaton, right? And you know, we often want to think of heaven as a state or a condition. No, it's a place. It's a place, a landscape with a king in a kingdom. It is. You know, we need to get back to this utterly concrete notion of what we're talking about when we're talking about redemption. And what Jean Hanny says is, so when the eternal Logos assumes human nature at the Annunciation, actually he assumes from Our Lady the entire universe. That he extends the permeation of the divine Logos into every aspect of creation. So she is the embodiment of the cosmos. She is that is why she's the queen of heaven and earth. That's why she's got the moon under her feet and a coronet of stars, because she embodies the entire cosmos. And one of the things that he approaches this from an alchemical perspective and says, you know, in the alchemical exercise of turning base metal into gold, what you have to first do is reduce base metal to materia prima in order to impose on it the new form of gold.
Right.
And what
That's beautiful.
What Our Lady is she is the embodiment of materia prima. She's the whole universe at its most basic principle, personified. And what she does is she turns everything into gold. So she is she's the alchemical queen, essentially.
Beautiful.
And so when you realize that that is the role that Our Lady really plays, that it's not all about these kind of rosy-cheeked 19th century images, but actually what we're talking about is the personification and embodiment of materia prima and the entire universe. Then when you look at the world, you realize it's Marian, and for all eternity, the universe, this will come to fruition at the unification of heaven and earth at the eschaton, has a Marian face, and then when you really enter into a participatory relationship with creation in the light of that, you see her everywhere. The whole universe bears the face of the Theotokos, and that's the gift that book gave me. And for those who take the role of Mary in the process of Christ's sanctification of the soul seriously, that is a book that everyone should read, I think.
Excellent.
Well,
Excellent.
you're reminding me.
I've written down a lot of books. Yeah.
You remind me of when I was a kid. I mean, little, like 5 years old. I remember asking my dad what heaven was like. He said, "It's like hunting."
Yeah.
Which I think that must have gone deeply into.
Yeah. I've always been intrigued by St. Francis of Sales saying heaven is the soul of the just. Isn't that interesting? You know, and I always think if these are different ways to always fructify whatever we're working with, you know, what different angles is that? I always sit with that one. I don't know if I've allowed it to fructify enough. Really fascinating, Sebastian. Yeah.
That's probably a good place to wrap it up.
Go ahead.
I'm going to have to go.
Before we go, because no doubt you're right, but I want to just comment on your father's remark that heaven is like hunting. I think that it should be of interest to us that the great mystics of the church, time and again, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, time and again, they use hunting as the analogy or the metaphor by which to understand the sanctification, the mystical experience. Teresa of Avila constantly talks about being quarry and Christ hunting her and shooting her with poisoned arrows. She says, you know,
how about the unicorn tapestries? You know,
the unicorn tapestry, and John of the Cross talks about himself as the stag. You know, that's longing for water, and then the as the psalm says, and then God appears and hunts him down, and consumes him. He becomes the life of God, and as God becomes his life, which is obviously a major theme in Eckhart. So this is So your father may have been seriously onto something there.
Yeah.
I think he
Wow,
was.
so well said. So well
He
said.
was
How
sincere
do
too.
how do
He was-
people get to know your work, Sebastian?
Well, I mean, I've got a few books out, so you can put my name into Amazon
Will do.
or
Okay.
something, and nearly all of my stuff is on the website of the European Conservative.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's where you can follow my
I
writing.
think I've read articles by you over the years without ever, sometime it all coalesces. Oh, wow, this is
Sure,
one
sure.
person.
That's
Every
that
so
guy.
often, an article on Burjayev or something takes me to the European Conservative and the
Right.
Brussels Review and things like that. Cool.
It's a great journal. I
Yeah.
feel very, very proud to
Yeah.
work for it and write for it. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, and we're the beneficiaries of that. So thank you, Sebastian Morello.
This has
And
been fun.
it has been fun. Yeah. This was so organic and went many different places. So thank you all for, thank you again, Sebastian. Thanks for listening to the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again very soon.